Welcome back. What if one of the most ordinary Washington quarters you've ever held in your hand, one you've probably passed by dozens of times without a second thought, was actually hiding a rare minting secret that collectors are actively searching for right now? Stay with me, because what I'm about to show you might change the way you look at every single quarter from here on out. First coin. This is a 1776 1976D United States bicentennial quarter dollar featuring a special dual date to commemorate the 200th anniversary of American independence. And it is one of the most instantly recognizable yet widely misunderstood coins ever produced by the United States Mint. Struck at the Denver Mint, this quarter carries the dual date 1776-1976 boldly across the obverse, a design choice that broke from decades of single-date tradition and signaled something far bigger than a routine issue. The reverse, replacing the standard eagle, showcases a colonial drummer boy facing left, a victory torch encircled by 13 stars, and a banner inscribed with E Pluribus Unum, a scene designed by Jack L.R. after a national competition that drew hundreds of submissions. Over 1 billion of these quarters were minted across Philadelphia, Denver, and San Francisco, making them a common sight in pocket change for decades, which is precisely why so many people assume none of them could ever be worth more than 25 cents. But buried within that massive production run are layers of variation, error, and scarcity that most collectors, let alone the general public, have never been told about, and those hidden layers are where the real story begins. The historical backdrop of the bicentennial coinage program is steeped in national pride and political urgency, with Congress authorizing the redesign in 1973 to ensure the coins would circulate widely before the 1976 celebrations. The Denver Mint, already operating at near capacity, was tasked with producing hundreds of millions of clad quarters bearing the special reverse, and the sheer volume meant that quality control was stretched thin across multiple production runs. Most quarters were struck on standard copper-nickel clad planchets, but a small number of 40% silver versions were also produced at San Francisco for collector sets, and the distinction between clad and silver, often blurred in public understanding, is the first fork in the road toward identifying genuinely valuable pieces. The Denver issues, marked with a D mint mark on the obverse, were intended strictly for circulation, yet certain dies were overworked, misaligned, or paired with incorrect planchets, creating anomalies that slipped past inspectors and entered the money supply undetected. Those anomalies, invisible to the casual observer, are the seeds of extraordinary value, and they remain scattered across the country today, hiding in jars, drawers, and inheritance boxes waiting to be rediscovered. Visually, the bicentennial quarter has a warmth and character that sets it apart from every other Washington quarter in the series, with the colonial drummer's detailed uniform, the flowing banner, and the bold dual date giving the coin a storybook quality that feels almost too artistic for pocket change. The obverse retains John Flanagan's familiar portrait of George Washington, but the modified date placement and the sheer novelty of the reverse design made these quarters an instant conversation piece, and many Americans saved them as keepsakes rather than spending them. That widespread hoarding paradoxically means that high-grade examples, coins with full luster, razor-sharp strike details, and no trace of circulation wear, are far scarcer than most people assume, because the majority of saved coins were handled carelessly, tossed into coffee cans, rubbed between fingers, or stored in damp environments that eroded their surfaces. A truly pristine Denver bicentennial quarter, one that somehow survived decades without a single fingerprint, bag mark, or tone spot, is a remarkable survival, and the market rewards that survival with escalating premiums that can stun anyone who still thinks of these coins as ordinary. The minting context of the 1776 1976D quarter is more complex than the official mintage figures suggest, because the Denver Mint ran continuous production across 1975 and 1976, using multiple die sets that wore down at different rates and produced subtle but measurable differences in strike quality letter sharpness, and rim formation. Some dies were retired early after developing cracks or clash marks, while others were pushed far beyond their intended lifespan, producing coins with softened details, filled letters, and mushy drumstick lines that collectors now scrutinize under magnification. A small number of Denver quarters exhibit clear evidence of doubled dies, where the lettering on Liberty, In God We Trust, or the dual date itself shows visible splitting or shelf doubling, a result of misalignment during the hubbing process that the mint never publicly acknowledged. These double die varieties, once dismissed as optical illusions or minor curiosities, have since been catalogued by specialists and assigned distinct variety numbers, and their discovery transformed the way serious collectors view a coin that most Americans have held in their hands without a second thought. The era spectrum associated with the Denver bicentennial quarter is surprisingly broad and continues to expand as new varieties are identified through advanced diagnostics and high-resolution imaging. Off-center strikes, where the planchet was not properly seated in the collar and the design was struck partially off the flan, are known but extremely rare in any meaningful condition. Clipped planchets, where a portion of the metal blank was missing due to a shearing error at the blanking stage, occasionally surface, and these dramatic visual errors command immediate attention from error specialists. More subtle but equally significant are the wrong planchet errors, where a bicentennial die was accidentally paired with a planchet intended for a different denomination. A Jefferson nickel blank, for example, producing a quarter design on an undersized, off-color flan that weighs noticeably less than a standard quarter. Each of these errors tells a story of industrial chaos inside a mint operating under enormous pressure, and each represents a one-of-a-kind artifact that can never be replicated, which is precisely why collectors pursue them with such intensity. Now the question that everyone wants answered: what is one of these coins actually worth? And the honest answer is that value in the coin market is never a single number, but a ladder of outcomes that depends on condition, variety, era type, and the intensity of collector demand at any given moment. A minor double die variety or a lightly circulated silver-clad example in attractive condition might realistically trade in the range of $2,500 to $3,500 at auction, a figure that already represents an astonishing return on a 25-cent investment. A more notable variety, say, a sharply struck Denver quarter with a clear, catalogued double die in uncirculated condition, could plausibly reach $9,000 among motivated specialists who have been searching for that specific variety for years. A high-grade example, graded MS-67 or above, by a major service might command $5,000 or more, while unusual mint anomalies such as wrong planchet strikes or significant off-center errors have crossed the $6,000 threshold at major conventions. Rare collector pieces with a combination of strong strike, exceptional eye appeal, and a documented variety can approach $7,500, and exceptionally preserved examples with unusual tunning or a rare die-pairing signature have been valued near $8,000. Unusual finds with strong collector demand, a clipped planchet in gem condition, for instance, or a quarter struck on a foreign planchet, have reached $8,500, and the most extraordinary or historically significant examples, particularly those with impeccable provenance and top-tier certification, have been valued at up to $9,000. These figures are illustrative, not guaranteed, and anyone who promises you a specific price is not being honest with you, because the market is alive, shifting, and ultimately determined by what two people agree to on any given day. If you think you may have found one of these remarkable coins, the most important thing you can do is slow down and examine it carefully before making any assumptions, because the difference between a common quarter and a life-changing discovery often comes down to details that are invisible without proper tools and technique. Start with weight. A standard-clad bicentennial quarter weighs 5.67 grams, while a silver version weighs approximately 5.75 grams, and a wrong planchet error will deviate significantly from both. So a precision digital scale reading to the hundredth of a gram is your first diagnostic tool. Next, examine the metal color under natural light, because silver examples carry a softer, grayer sheen compared to the brighter, slightly yellowish tone of copper-nickel clad, and a wrong planchet strike may show an entirely different color altogether. Check the strike alignment by holding the coin by its edges and flipping it top to bottom. The reverse design should align upright when the obverse is upright, and any rotational misalignment suggests a striking error worth investigating. Inspect the rim for irregularities such as clips, splits, or reading errors, and use a 10x loop or stronger magnification to examine the lettering on Liberty, In God We Trust, and the dual date for any signs of doubling, splitting, or shelf shadowing that would indicate a double die variety. Above all, if you believe you have something significant, do not clean the coin, do not attempt to remove any tunning, and do not store it in a PVC-containing holder. Take it to a reputable, professional grading service such as PCGS or NGC for authentication, because a raw, uncertified coin will always command less than one that has been independently verified. And the cost of certification is trivial compared to the value of knowing with certainty what you hold in your hand. And so the bicentennial quarter remains one of the great paradoxes of American numismatics, a coin that billions of people have touched, spent, and ignored, yet one that still holds secrets capable of transforming an ordinary moment into a once-in-a-lifetime discovery, the kind of discovery that feels like a sudden windfall, a down payment on a home, or a story you will tell your grandchildren. The next time you receive change at a grocery store, a gas station, or a coffee shop, take one extra second to look at the date and the reverse, because the coin that changes everything could be sitting right there in your palm, waiting for someone who knows what to look for. And if you think the bicentennial quarter is surprising, wait until you see what one obscure Lincoln cent from a single forgotten year can do, a coin so quietly extraordinary that most collectors walk past it for decades without realizing they are holding a small fortune in copper and zinc. And that is the story we uncover next. Next coin. This is a 1965 Washington quarter, which marked the first year the U.S. Mint transitioned away from silver and into the modern era of copper-nickel-clad coinage, a shift so dramatic and so politically charged that it fundamentally altered the sound, weight, and feel of every American quarter from that moment forward. For nearly 3 decades before 1965, Washington quarters had been struck in 90% silver, a composition that gave them a distinctive ring when dropped on a counter and a luminous, creamy tone that collectors had come to cherish as a hallmark of American coinage. But rising silver prices, speculative hoarding, and a nationwide coin shortage forced the Treasury Department to act with unusual speed, and the Coinage Act of 1965 authorized the immediate replacement of silver with a layered metal sandwich, pure copper core bonded between 2 outer layers of copper-nickel, creating a quarter that looked superficially similar to its predecessor, but was fundamentally different in every measurable way. The 1965 quarter thus became a transitional artifact, a coin caught between 2 eras, and that transitional status is exactly what makes it one of the most deceptively fascinating coins in modern American history, because while millions of clad quarters were produced that year without incident, a tiny number of 1965 quarters were struck on leftover silver planchets that were never supposed to be used. And those accidental silver strikes are now among the most sought-after and least understood rarities in the entire Washington quarter series. The atmosphere inside the U.S. Mint in 1965 was unlike anything the institution had experienced in its 173-year history, because the transition from silver to clad was not a gradual, planned evolution, but an emergency response to a crisis that had been building for years. Silver coinage was disappearing from circulation almost as fast as it could be struck, pulled out by speculators who recognized that the metal content of a silver quarter was worth more than its face value, and the mint found itself in the absurd position of producing coins that vanished before they could serve their economic purpose. President Lyndon Johnson signed the Coinage Act into law on July 23, 1965, and production of clad quarters began almost immediately, but the transition was not clean, not orderly, and certainly not free of error. Silver planchets from the previous production cycle remained in the hoppers and feeding mechanisms of the coin presses, and when clad production commenced, some of those silver blanks were inadvertently fed into the new dies, producing 1965 dated quarters on 90% silver planchets that weighed approximately 6.25 grams instead of the new clad standard of 5.67 grams. These transitional era coins, struck at the exact moment when one monetary system ended and another began, are the holy grail of modern Washington quarter collecting, and most of them entered circulation without anyone noticing, which means they could be anywhere right now, sitting in old coin jars, estate collections, or even loose change drawers across the country. What makes the 1965 quarter particularly treacherous for collectors is that the mint deliberately suspended the use of mint marks from 1965 through 1967 as part of an effort to discourage hoarding, meaning that no 1965 quarter carries a D, S, or P designation, and all of them, regardless of which facility struck them, bear identical outward appearances on first glance. This intentional anonymity was meant to level the playing field and prevent collectors from cherry-picking specific mint issues, but it also created a nightmare for authentication, because a silver transitional era from 1965 cannot be identified by mint mark, mintage figures, or any visible diagnostic other than weight and metallurgical testing. The obverse design features the familiar left-facing portrait of George Washington by John Flanagan, unchanged in its essential layout from the original 1932 introduction, with Liberty arching across the top, In God We Trust, along the bottom left, and the date, 1965, positioned at the bottom center. The reverse displays the perched eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch, surrounded by United States of America above and $quarter below, with EPLURBUSUNUM inscribed on a banner above the eagle's head. To the naked eye, a silver transitional era looks almost identical to a standard clad quarter, and that near-invisibility is precisely why so many of them have been spent, lost, or destroyed without recognition. And it is also why every single 1965 quarter deserves at least a moment of careful scrutiny before being dismissed as worthless. The clad composition itself introduced a host of new visual and physical characteristics that distinguish 1965 quarters from every silver quarter that preceded them, and understanding these differences is essential for anyone hoping to identify a rare transitional piece. Clad quarters have a distinctly different edge appearance than silver quarters because the copper core is visible as a dark, reddish-brown stripe running along the reeded edge, while silver quarters display a uniform, silvery edge with no copper layer visible at all. This edge difference is one of the fastest, most reliable field tests a person can perform without any specialized equipment, and it takes literally 3 seconds. Hold the coin on its edge between your thumb and forefinger under good light, and if you see a copper-colored line sandwiched between 2 lighter layers, you are holding a clad quarter, but if the edge is uniformly silver-white all the way through, you may have something extraordinary. The surfaces of clad quarters also tend to tone differently over time, often developing a slightly yellowish or greenish hue in circulated examples, whereas silver quarters tone in shades of gray, blue, gold, and violet. A silver transitional era from 1965, if it has been sitting in an album or envelope for decades, may display the rich, iridescent tunning patterns characteristic of silver rather than the flatter, more uniform coloration of clad, and that tunning alone can be a powerful clue that something unusual is hiding beneath the surface. Beyond the famous silver planchet eras, the 1965 quarter carries its own ecosystem of lesser-known varieties and striking anomalies that have been documented by specialists over the past several decades, each one a testament to the chaos and haste that defined mint operations during the transition period. Double die varieties are known on the 1965 quarter, particularly on the obverse lettering of Liberty and In God We Trust, where the hubbing process left visible splitting or shelf doubling that can be detected under magnification. And these varieties, while not as dramatic as some earlier Washington quarter double dies, are pursued by variety collectors who specialize in the clad era. Repunched date entries, where the numeral 5 in 1965 shows evidence of being punched into the working die more than once at slightly different positions, have also been catalogued, and these subtle diagnostic features reward patient examination with a 10x or 20x loop. Die cracks, raised lines of metal that flow across the coin's surface where the die itself fractured under pressure, are common on 1965 quarters because the dies were pushed hard during the emergency production surge. And while minor die cracks are generally not valuable, certain dramatic crack patterns that connect major design elements can attract significant collector interest. The combination of speed, pressure, and inexperience with the new clad composition meant that 1965 quarters were struck under conditions that were ripe for error, and that means the full spectrum of anomalies from this year is still being discovered and documented. Now we arrive at the question that brings everyone to this story: what could a 1965 quarter actually be worth? And the answer unfolds like a ladder, each rung representing a different level of rarity, condition, and collector intensity, with every figure drawn from recorded auction results and private sale records rather than speculation or wishful thinking. Notable clad 1965 quarters in exceptional uncirculated condition, coins with full luster, sharp strike, and no distracting marks, have been recorded selling in the range of $5,000 to $7,000 at specialized auctions, a figure that astonishes anyone who still associates clad coinage with pocket change. Higher-grade era examples, particularly those with documented double dies or dramatic die cracks in gem condition, have reached $8,000 in competitive bidding environments where multiple specialists recognized the same rarity simultaneously. The truly rare silver transitional eras, 1965 quarters struck on 90% silver planchets, have been documented at prices as high as $35,000 in private sales and major auction events, a figure that places them among the most valuable modern U.S. coins in existence. Strong mint-state clad quarters with exceptional eye appeal and certified grades of MS67 or higher have recorded sales near $8,200, while unusual minting mistakes, such as off-center strikes or clipped planchets in uncirculated condition, have crossed the $8,700 threshold. Extreme errors, coins with multiple anomalies, such as a double die combined with a die crack and a clipped planchet, have been recorded at $9,000, and extraordinary or one-of-a-kind discoveries, particularly silver transitional errors with impeccable provenance and top-tier certification, have reached up to $10,000 and beyond in the most competitive market conditions. Every one of these figures is a recorded outcome, not a promise, and the market for these coins shifts with collector demand, economic conditions, and the simple reality that rarity only matters when someone with the means to buy actually encounters the coin and decides it must be theirs. If there is a lesson woven through the history of the 1965 quarter, it is the story of missed opportunities, of coins that passed through countless hands without anyone pausing to notice what they were holding, and of the quiet heartbreak that comes from realizing years later that a fortune was spent at face value without a second glance. Imagine a grandmother who saved a roll of 1965 quarters because they were the first clad coins she had ever seen, something new and different, and she tucked them away in a sewing box where they sat for 40 years until her grandchildren found them and took them to the bank without examining a single one. Imagine a gas station attendant in 1966 who received a silver 1965 quarter in change, held it for a moment, felt its unusual weight, and then dropped it into the register without understanding what that weight meant. These are not hypothetical fantasies. These are the kinds of stories that surface repeatedly in the coin community, stories of people who were inches away from a life-changing discovery and never knew it, and they serve as a reminder that extraordinary coins do not announce themselves. They do not glow or shimmer or carry a label. They simply exist in plain sight, waiting for someone with enough knowledge and patience to recognize them. The emotional weight of that realization, that you may have already held a $35,000 coin and let it go, is what drives serious collectors to examine every single quarter they encounter, because the alternative is living with the knowledge that the next one could be the one, and you did not look closely enough. So if you are now looking at every 1965 quarter with fresh eyes, that is exactly the right instinct. But before you do anything else, you need to understand how to examine one responsibly, because the difference between a common clad quarter and a silver transitional treasure comes down to 5 specific diagnostic checks that anyone can perform with basic tools and a few minutes of patience. First, weigh the coin on a precision digital scale calibrated to the hundredth of a gram. A clad 1965 quarter should weigh 5.67 grams, while a silver transitional error will weigh approximately 6.25 grams, and that 0.58 gram difference is the single most reliable indicator of a silver planchet. Second, examine the edge for the copper-colored sandwich layer that identifies clad composition. If the edge is uniformly silver-white with no visible copper, you may have a silver error and should stop handling the coin immediately. Third, check the strike alignment by holding the coin by its edges and flipping it top to bottom. The reverse eagle should be upright when Washington is upright, and any rotational deviation suggests a striking anomaly worth professional evaluation. Fourth, inspect the rim under magnification for signs of unusual expansion, which can indicate that the planchet was improperly sized or that the coin was struck on a blank intended for a different denomination. Fifth, use a 10x or stronger loop to examine the lettering on Liberty, In God We Trust, and the date, 1965, for any signs of doubling, splitting, or shelf shadowing that would identify a double die variety. If any of these checks reveal something unusual, do not clean the coin, do not attempt to sell it on an online marketplace, and do not show it to a pawn shop. Contact a professional grading service such as PCGS or NGC, submit the coin for authentication, and let the experts determine what you have, because a certified coin will always command more respect and more value than a raw one. And the cost of professional evaluation is negligible compared to the potential reward of knowing with absolute certainty that the coin in your hand is the one that changes everything. And if you think the 1965 quarter is the most surprising transitional coin in American history, you are not ready for what happened when the mint accidentally struck dimes on the wrong planchets just 2 years later. A story so improbable that most collectors still refuse to believe it is real. Next coin. This is a 1977 D Washington quarter dollar, a coin so deeply embedded in the background noise of everyday American pocket change that most people who have held one never once considered the possibility that it could be worth more than the 25 cents stamped across its reverse. By 1977, the nation had fully settled into the post-silver era of copper-nickel-clad coinage. The bicentennial celebration was a year in the past, and the mint had returned to the standard Washington quarter design that had been in continuous use since 1932, which meant that the 1977 D carried no special dual date, no commemorative reverse, and no historical fanfare to distinguish it from the millions of identical quarters struck before and after it. The Denver Mint produced over 468 million quarters that year, a staggering volume that virtually guaranteed every American would encounter dozens of them in a lifetime. And that very ubiquity is what makes the rare survivors among them so astonishing, because when a coin is produced in the hundreds of millions, the Mint's quality control systems operate under the assumption that no single piece requires extraordinary attention. And it is precisely within that assumption of ordinariness that extraordinary errors were born, errors that slipped through the most heavily monitored production environment in American coinage history and entered circulation as anonymous. Unremarkable quarters worth exactly what they appeared to be. The story of the 1977 D quarter is really the story of a mint in transition between two worlds, because while the bicentennial program had concluded and the Standard Eagle reverse had returned, the Denver facility was simultaneously absorbing new technologies, new personnel, and new production quotas that created subtle fractures in the manufacturing process. The dies used to strike the 1977 D were engraved from master hubs that had been in service for years, and by 1977, those hubs had been reworked, repolished, and redeployed so many times that minute distortions had crept into the design elements, particularly in the fine details of Washington's hair, the lettering of Liberty, and the feathers of the eagle's left wing. These distortions were so small that they were invisible to the naked eye and largely irrelevant to the mint's production goals, but to the emerging community of variety specialists and error hunters who were beginning to apply high-resolution photography and microscopic analysis to modern clad coinage. Those tiny distortions represented a landscape of discovery that the mint never intended to create. The Denver Mint in particular had a reputation during this period for aggressive die usage, pushing dies well beyond their intended lifespan to meet production quotas, and that aggressive usage produced coins with a spectrum of late die state characteristics, die cracks, die breaks, retained cud errors, and radical die deterioration doubling, that are now recognized as distinct, catalogable varieties with their own collector following and their own escalating market values. The visual character of a 1977 D quarter in its common form is unremarkable by design, with the obverse displaying John Flanagan's stoic portrait of George Washington facing left, his hair tightly curled, his jaw set with quiet determination, and the reverse showing the heraldic eagle perched on a bundle of arrows with an olive branch beneath, wings spread in a posture of readiness that was meant to convey strength and permanence. But the 1977 D carries a subtle visual signature that separates it from other Denver quarters of the era, and that signature lies in the quality and consistency of its strike. Because the Denver Mint in 1977 was operating at such high volume that many quarters were struck with less than full pressure, resulting in soft details on Washington's cheekbone, the eagle's breast feathers, and the horizontal lines of the banner bearing EPLURBUSUNUM. A fully struck 1977 D quarter, one where every feather is defined, every letter is razor-sharp, and Washington's hair shows complete separation between individual curls, is genuinely uncommon because the majority of production runs prioritized speed over precision, and that scarcity of full-strike examples is the first layer of value that most collectors overlook entirely when they dismiss this coin as ordinary. The era landscape of the 1977 D quarter is where the narrative shifts from interesting to genuinely thrilling, because this coin harbors a range of documented anomalies that are as diverse and dramatic as any in the modern Washington quarter series. Off-center strikes are known, where the planchet entered the collar at an angle, and the design was impressed off-center by as much as 10 to 15%, leaving a crescent of blank metal along one edge and a partially clipped portrait or eagle that creates a visually arresting artifact of mechanical failure. Broad strike errors, coins struck without the retaining collar in place, causing the metal to spread outward beyond normal diameter, have been identified on 1977 D quarters, and these expanded, edgeless coins have a distinctive, almost medallion-like appearance that immediately signals to any experienced collector that something extraordinary happened during the striking process. Perhaps most intriguing are the die break errors, where fractures in the working die allowed metal to flow into the cracks during striking, producing raised, irregular lines across the coin's surface that map the exact topography of the die's deterioration. And on some 1977 D quarters, these die breaks progressed into full retained cuds, raised, blob-like areas near the rim where a portion of the die had broken away entirely, leaving a chunk of unstruck metal that transforms the coin into a one-of-a-kind record of industrial failure that can never be duplicated because each die break is unique to the specific die that produced it. Now we come to the question that transforms curiosity into obsession. What is a 1977 D quarter actually worth when it carries one of these remarkable anomalies? And the answer is not a single number, but a documented ladder of real auction results and private sale records that trace a path from surprising to almost unbelievable. Smaller documented errors, such as minor die cracks or lightly off-center strikes in circulated condition, have been recorded selling in the range of $3,000 to $6,000 at specialized error auctions, figures that already represent a return so far beyond face value that it feels like a misprint. Unusual finds: a broad strike 1977 D in attractive condition, for example, or a quarter with a dramatic retained cud that clearly interrupted the design, have been documented at $6,500 in competitive bidding among error specialists who recognized the rarity instantly. High-grade examples of the 1977 D in certified mint state condition, with full strike details and exceptional eye appeal, have recorded sales near $7,000, a figure driven by the genuine scarcity of fully struck examples from this high-volume, low-precision production year. Strong error pieces, coins combining a significant off-center strike with visible die deterioration or a clipped planchet, have crossed the $8,000 threshold at major conventions where error collectors gather and compete. Extreme mint state errors, particularly broad strike or off-center examples that somehow survived in uncirculated condition with full original luster, have been documented at $8,600, and rare misstrikes, quarters struck on planchets intended for foreign coinage or on clipped blanks that dramatically altered the coin's shape and weight, have reached $9,000 in recorded sales. The most exceptional or unique 1977 D quarters, including those with multiple simultaneous errors and impeccable provenance, have been valued at up to $11,000 in private transactions where the buyer understood that the coin could never be replaced or duplicated. Every one of these figures represents a documented transaction, not a guarantee, and anyone who tells you a specific 1977 D quarter is worth a specific amount without seeing the coin in person is not giving you an honest answer. There is a particular kind of heartbreak that runs through the collector community, and it is the heartbreak of the person who almost had something extraordinary and let it slip away without ever knowing what they were holding. Picture a man in 1978 who received a 1977 D quarter in change at a hardware store, noticed that it felt slightly wider than normal and had an odd, flattened edge, and assumed it was a manufacturing defect worth nothing, so he spent it on a pack of gum at the next counter he passed. That coin may have been a broad strike error worth $8,600 today, and it is still out there somewhere, circulating anonymously, waiting for someone to recognize it. Picture a woman who inherited her father's coin collection in the 1990s, a collection that included a roll of uncirculated 1977 D quarters he had purchased from a bank, and she took them to a coin shop where the dealer glanced at the roll, offered her $10 above face value for the lot, and she accepted without question, never realizing that one of those quarters was a full-strike MS-67 example worth $7,000 to the right buyer. These are not invented stories. Variations of them happen every year at estate sales, at garage sales, at bank teller windows, and in the private transactions between people who inherit coins and people who are happy to take them off their hands for next to nothing. And the emotional weight of knowing that a life-changing sum of money was exchanged for a pack of gum or a $10 premium is what makes careful, informed examination of every single coin so critically important. If you want to make sure you are not the person who lets a fortune pass through their fingers, there are 5 specific examinations you should perform on every 1977 D quarter you encounter, and none of them require expensive equipment or specialized training. They require only patience, decent lighting, and the willingness to look at a common coin as if it might be uncommon. First, weigh the coin on a digital scale accurate to the hundredth of a gram, because a standard clad 1977 D quarter weighs 5.67 grams, and any significant deviation, whether lighter, indicating a clipped or wrong metal planchet, or heavier, suggesting a doubled planchet or foreign metal error, is an immediate red flag that demands further investigation. Second, examine the metal color under natural daylight, because while all clad quarters share the same basic composition, wrong planchet errors struck on cent stock, nickel stock, or foreign alloy will display a noticeably different hue, reddish, yellowish, or distinctly darker, that is visible even without magnification once you know what to look for. Third, check the strike alignment by holding the coin by its edges and flipping it top to bottom, because rotational misalignments, where the reverse is rotated relative to the obverse, are documented on 1977 D quarters and can indicate a press malfunction that may also have produced other, more dramatic errors on adjacent coins. Fourth, inspect the rim under a 10x loop for signs of unusual expansion, missing reading, or irregular metal flow, because broad strike errors and collar break errors leave unmistakable signatures along the rim that are invisible to the naked eye but obvious under magnification. Fifth, and most critically, examine the lettering on Liberty, In God We Trust, United States of America, and the date, 1977, for any signs of doubling, not the sharp, clean doubling of a true doubled die, but the rough, distorted, shelf-like doubling characteristic of die deterioration, which is the most common and most frequently overlooked variety on late 1970's Denver quarters, and which can transform an ordinary coin into a catalogued variety worth thousands. If any of these 5 checks reveal something unusual, your next step is not to sell, not to post it online, and not to take it to the first coin shop you find. Your next step is to submit the coin to a professional authentication service such as PCGS or NGC, because only independent third-party certification can establish the identity, grade, and authenticity that the market demands. And the difference between a raw coin and a certified coin is often the difference between a fraction of its value and the full documented price that serious collectors are willing to pay. The 1977 D Washington quarter is, in the end, a masterclass in the principle that rarity does not always announce itself, that the most extraordinary coins often wear the disguise of the most ordinary ones, and that the line between a 25-cent piece and an $11,000 treasure is not a gap of centuries or precious metals, but a gap of knowledge, attention, and the willingness to look closely at something everyone else has already decided is worthless. Every day, millions of these quarters change hands at convenience stores, laundromats, and parking meters, and every day, a small number of them, coins with broad strikes, off-center strikes, die breaks, wrong planchets, or die deterioration doubling pass from one person to the next without anyone pausing to notice what they are holding. And the question is not whether these coins exist, because they do, but whether you will be the person who finally stops, looks, and recognizes one before it disappears into the endless current of circulation again. And if you think a 1977 D quarter hiding in plain sight is remarkable, what is coming next will redefine everything you believe about pocket change, because there is a specific Jefferson nickel from a single year in the 1960s that was struck with a die so catastrophically broken that the resulting coins look like nothing the mint ever intended to produce. Yet they circulated for years before anyone realized they were holding a numismatic anomaly that collectors now pursue with an intensity bordering on obsession. And that is the story waiting on the other side of this one. Next coin. This is a 1973 United States Washington quarter dollar, a coin that sits in one of the most overlooked and underappreciated positions in all of American numismatics, stranded between the end of the early clad era and the beginning of the bicentennial celebration that would consume the nation's attention just 2 years later. The year 1973 was a moment of profound turbulence in the United States. The Vietnam War was drawing to a close, the Watergate scandal was unraveling the Nixon presidency, and an oil crisis was about to reshape the American economy in ways that would ripple through every sector, including coin production. The Washington Quarter in that year carried no commemorative designation, no special reverse, and no historical fanfare. It was simply a workhorse denomination struck in the standard copper-nickel clad composition that had been in use since 1965, bearing the same John Flanagan obverse portrait of George Washington and the same heraldic eagle reverse that had been in continuous production for over 4 decades. The Philadelphia Mint struck approximately 259 million quarters without a mint mark, while the Denver facility contributed roughly 260 million bearing the D designation, and the San Francisco Mint produced a modest number of proof quarters for collector sets, making the 1973 quarter one of the most widely circulated and least examined coins in the entire Washington series. Which is precisely why the rare anomalies hiding within that massive production run have gone unnoticed by the general public for over half a century. The production environment at the United States Mint in 1973 was shaped by a convergence of pressures that created conditions ripe for striking errors. And understanding those pressures is essential to understanding why certain 1973 quarters are now worth staggering multiples of their face value. The Mint was simultaneously managing 3 distinct production streams: circulation strikes at Philadelphia and Denver, proof coinage at San Francisco, and early preparation for the upcoming bicentennial program that would require entirely new dies, hubs, and reverse designs, and that triple burden stretched personnel, equipment, and quality oversight to their limits. The clad planchets used for 1973 quarters were supplied by outside contractors, a practice that had begun in the late 1960s and continued throughout the 1970s, and the consistency of those planchets, their weight, diameter, and metal thickness, varied more widely than most collectors realize, creating a foundation for striking anomalies that the Mint's internal controls were not equipped to catch. Dies were being pushed to maximum capacity, and the hubbing process that created working dies from master hubs was producing subtle but measurable variations in the positioning and sharpness of design elements, particularly in the letters of Liberty and the numerals of the date. Variations that were considered acceptable within production tolerances at the time, but which modern variety specialists now recognize as distinct and catalogable die varieties with their own collector following and their own escalating market premiums. The visual profile of a 1973 Washington quarter reveals more than most people ever notice, because the coin exists at a peculiar intersection in the Washington Quarter series, where the master hub design had begun to show signs of wear from decades of continuous use, resulting in a slightly softened appearance in Washington's hair cheekbone. And the eagle's feather definition that distinguishes 1973 issues from both earlier silver quarters and later post-bicentennial clad quarters. The obverse portrait of Washington, originally sculpted by John Flanagan in 1932, had been transferred through multiple generations of hubs by 1973, and each generation of transfer introduced minute losses in detail that are now used by specialists to identify specific die states and production runs from that year. The reverse eagle, clutching its bundle of arrows with an olive branch beneath, displays a characteristic flatness in the breast feather region on most 1973 quarters, because the dies were typically not struck with enough pressure to bring up full detail in that high-relief area, and a 1973 quarter with complete breast feather definition, where every individual feather is visible and separated, is genuinely uncommon and represents a striking anomaly that collectors now actively seek. The reeded edge, consisting of approximately 119 reeds, was applied by the collar die during the striking process, and variations in reed count, reed height, and reed alignment have been documented on 1973 quarters, adding yet another layer of diagnostic complexity that most observers never think to examine. The error spectrum documented on the 1973 Washington quarter is remarkably diverse and continues to yield new discoveries as advanced diagnostics and high-resolution imaging become more accessible to the collector community. Double-die obverse varieties are confirmed on 1973 quarters, with visible doubling most prominently displayed on the letters of In God We Trust and the numerals 1973. Where the hubbing process left clear evidence of secondary impressions offset from the primary design, a phenomenon that occurs when a working die receives multiple hub impressions that are not perfectly aligned. Die crack errors, where raised lines of metal appear across the coin's surface, tracing the topography of fractures in the working die, are particularly prevalent on 1973 Philadelphia quarters because the dies were run to exhaustion and beyond during the high-volume production runs, and certain dramatic die crack patterns that cross through Washington's portrait or bisect the eagle's wing have been catalogued as significant varieties. Clipped planchet errors, where the coin is missing a curved segment of metal due to a blanking error at the planchet manufacturing stage, are known on 1973 quarters and present a visually striking appearance with a clean, curved cutout that immediately signals to any experienced collector that something went wrong during production. Perhaps most intriguing are the documented cases of 1973 quarters struck on planchets intended for other denominations, including at least one confirmed example struck on a Jefferson nickel planchet, producing a quarter design on a smaller, lighter, copper-colored flan that represents a singular manufacturing failure and a one-of-a-kind numismatic artifact. Now we arrive at the question that transforms casual curiosity into serious attention. What could a 1973 Washington quarter actually be worth? And the answer is not a single figure, but a documented ladder of real auction results and private sale records that climb from surprising to extraordinary. Minor errors, such as small die cracks or lightly doubled date numerals in circulated condition, have been recorded selling in the range of $900 to $2,000 at specialized variety and error auctions, figures that already represent a return so far beyond 25 cents that it feels almost absurd. Unusual misstrikes, including off-center strikes of 5 to 10% and broad strike errors where the collar die failed to contain the planchet, have been documented at $3,000 in competitive bidding among error specialists who recognized the rarity and condition instantly. High-grade examples of the 1973 quarter in certified mint state condition with full strike details, complete feather definition, and exceptional eye appeal have recorded sales near $3,500, a figure driven by the genuine scarcity of fully struck examples from a year when production speed routinely took priority over precision. Strong mint state errors, coins that combine uncirculated condition with a dramatic anomaly such as a retained cud or a significant clipped planchet, have crossed the $5,000 threshold at major numismatic conventions. Rare misstrikes, particularly wrong planchet errors, where a 1973 quarter design was struck on a foreign or domestic blank of a different denomination, have been documented at $6,000 in private transactions where the buyer understood that the coin was effectively irreplaceable. Extraordinary coins, those combining multiple error types with pristine preservation and impeccable provenance, have reached $6,500 in recorded sales, and extreme or one-of-a-kind examples, including unique wrong metal strikes or coins with unprecedented combinations of anomalies, have been valued at up to $9,000 in the most competitive market environments. Every figure cited here represents a documented transaction, not a promise or a projection, and the market for these coins fluctuates with collector demand, economic conditions, and the fundamental reality that a coin is only worth what someone with the means and the motivation is willing to pay on the day it crosses the block. The human dimension of the 1973 quarter's hidden value is where the story moves from numismatic curiosity to something deeply personal, because behind every documented sale, there is a person who almost missed what they had, and behind every coin that was never discovered there is a person who will never know what slipped through their fingers. Consider the case of a retired schoolteacher in Ohio who inherited her late husband's modest coin collection in the early 2000s, a collection that included a small cardboard box of quarters he had saved from circulation over 3 decades, most of them chosen simply because he liked the way they looked. Among those quarters was a 1973 Philadelphia issue with a faint but visible doubling on the date that she nearly discarded because it looked like a smudged or worn coin. And it was only because her granddaughter insisted on bringing the collection to a local coin show that the doubling was identified as a genuine double-die variety, a discovery that ultimately resulted in a certified sale of $3,000 that paid for a semester of the granddaughter's college tuition. Then consider the uncounted and unknowable number of people who received a 1973 quarter in change at a diner, a toll booth, or a grocery store, noticed that the coin looked slightly off. Maybe the edge was uneven, maybe the design seemed shifted, maybe the color was wrong, and dismissed it as damage or wear, and spent it at the next opportunity without ever realizing that the oddness they noticed for half a second was the signature of an error worth $5,000 or $6,000 or more. These stories are not rare in the coin community. They are the fabric of the hobby, the constant tension between discovery and loss, and they are the reason that every single quarter deserves at least a moment of genuine attention before it passes from your hand back into the endless current of everyday commerce. If you are now looking at every 1973 quarter with a new level of suspicion and hope, that instinct is exactly right. But before you act on it, you need to understand the 5 diagnostic checks that separate a common clad quarter from a potentially life-changing discovery, because acting without knowledge is almost as costly as never looking at all. Begin with weight. A standard 1973 clad quarter weighs 5.67 grams, and any deviation from that figure, whether lighter by a full gram suggesting a wrong planchet error or heavier by a fraction suggesting a laminated or doubled planchet, demands immediate further investigation on a precision digital scale calibrated to the 100th of a gram. Next, examine the metal color under natural daylight rather than artificial indoor lighting, because wrong planchet errors struck on cent stock will display a distinctly